Welcome to a special presentation of the C.S. Lewis Society's Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Live from the A la Carte Pavilion in Tampa. This live event and discussion is sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Society and features Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, Dr. David Berlinski, and Dr. Tom Woodward. Now your MC and host for this event from the Salem Radio Network and Talk Radio 860 WGUL, here's Michael Medved.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to this very special event, and it's very inspiring to see this huge crowd and to be participating with this outstanding array of contributors for the C.S. Lewis Society. First, a couple of very quick announcements. We do need to thank the world-famous Trade Winds Island Resort, which has provided accommodations for many of the participants in tonight's proceedings. Alas, not me, but next time. Next time. And we also want to thank the Digital Lightbridge Company for providing assistance with graphics for tonight's program. And thank you very much. And one very important upcoming announcement. Now, after tonight, I am sure many of you will want to have more time to explore the fascinating mind and world-renowned wit of Dr. David Berlinski. Because he truly is one of the most interesting people on the planet. I mean, first of all, he chooses to live in Paris. And you'll have an opportunity to explore all of that with Dr. Berlinski, with a second helping of Dr. David Berlinski, coming up on tomorrow night. That would be Friday night at 7 p.m. He is going to be speaking on Has Science Buried God? And he will be delivering more than a yes or no answer. Promise. And that is going to be taking place 7 p.m. tomorrow night, Friday night, at the Oval Theater at the Marshall Center at USF. And there is a note here that says you don't want to miss it, but you really don't want to miss it. And at this point, let me begin tonight by a couple of sort of remarks about why this issue that we're all going to be describing and discussing and approaching from so many different perspectives is such a crucial issue, and one that mobilizes this huge response here. I mean, this is like a political rally. You wish you got this is sort of the intelligent design tea party, I think. But what is it about this issue that mobilizes people? And I want to suggest to you that part of what mobilizes people is the fact that there are literally millions of Americans who recognize that there are ubiquitous, common, completely unrefuted often lies that are promulgated about intelligent design. And you may know that in 2008 I came out with a book called The 10 Big Lies About America, and we were privileged to be for 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Last year, just the very end of the year, actually just December 9th, my new book, The 5 Big Lies About American Business, was released by Random House, and there will be copies out there which I'll be glad to sign for you afterward. That's intelligent design for you right there. And so I thought I would speak to you very briefly tonight by way of introduction, since we've done 10 big lies and 5 big lies, about the 3 big lies about intelligent design. Stuff that you hear all the time that just has no connection with the truth whatsoever. And the first of the big lies about intelligent design is that intelligent design is the same as creationism. And very often people who are trying to smear intelligent design will say that this is simply creationism. This is a way that extremely knuckle-gragging, troglodytic, ignorant Princeton graduates like Dr. Woodward would try to advance their old-fashioned backwoods conception of primitive religious faith, and that this is only adhered to by people with missing teeth and tobacco juice spurting through it and Confederate flag decals on their pickup trucks. That appears to be the general idea, that is what intelligent design is. It's people who basically claim that the world was literally created in 6 days, and that is the truth, and anyone who questions the idea of 6 24-hour days of creation is not someone who could possibly support intelligent design. Let me make it very clear here. What we are talking about tonight, and some of the magnificently sophisticated scientific argument advanced by Dr. Meyer and by Dr. Berlinski and by Dr. Woodward, what we are talking about is not young Earth creationism. And the core difference between creationism and intelligent design is intelligent design is at its very core scientific. It is a desire to look at more scientific evidence, not less. Creationism takes its basic quest for sources to Scripture. Nothing wrong with it, but it's different. And that's why the attempt to conflate the two, there is a museum in Louisville, Kentucky that again, people have used to try to associate with the work of the Discovery Institute or of the C.S. Lewis Society. No one on this panel would suggest that Adam was created and the world was created literally less than 6,000 years ago and in a literal 6-day period. That is not what we are talking about tonight. Second big lie about intelligent design is the idea that people who advocate for intelligent design and would like intelligent design to be included in school curricula are trying to suppress free speech and trying to extinguish the ability of American school children to learn about evolution. This is a gigantic lie. If there was a replay of the Scopes trial in modern times, it was that trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, where the roles were reversed. Please understand, the first Scopes monkey trial was a trial on a law that did make it illegal to teach evolution. There is not a single intelligent designer anywhere in the world, someone who advocates for ID, who has made the case that people should be denied evidence for random natural selection, or that people should grow up ignorant of the theory of evolution. No one calls for that. There is only one side to this argument that is called for the suppression of free speech, and that's the other side. Because the whole idea that it is somehow wrong to question anything, we live in a skeptical country. People question absolutely everything in the United States. I mean, people can question things about God. People can even sometimes question things about President Obama. It's permitted. It's permitted. But it is not permitted to question anything about Charles Darwin, or to question his evidence, or to question some of the means by which people have argued for random natural selection. The attempt to suppress discussion is not an attempt that originates with this side of the debate. It is an attempt that is characteristic entirely and exclusively of the other side of the debate. And the third big lie about intelligent design is the big lie that suggests that intelligent design is a last-ditch, desperate attempt to shore up crumbling religious belief in the face of the assault of science, logic, and truth. And you've heard all of this a great deal. I mean, again, it's part of the whole characterization of advocates for intelligent design as people who want to replace logic, evidence, science, argument, free exchange of ideas with uncompromising religious faith. One of the things that I find particularly upsetting as someone who's been active in the Jewish community for most of my adult life is the idea that somehow intelligent designers, people who advocate for intelligent design, people like Dr. Woodward and Dr. Berlinski and Dr. Meyer, are the equivalent of the American Taliban. That we are attempting to, first of all, I don't see Mrs. Meyer is here, no burqa tonight. But And I'm sure Stephen is grateful for that. But in any event, the whole idea that the intelligent design argument is associated with religious repression, because to discuss Darwin even is to assault the very basis of Christian or Judeo-Christian faith, this is a canard. It is not true. It has no connection with the truth. One of the things that is very striking about this is it's sometimes related to other arguments that people have about life on other planets. I happen to be skeptical about life on other planets. Why? Not because my religious faith tells me to be, but because I see no evidence that life exists on other planets. Here's the difference. Talking about life on other planets, if all of a sudden we discover little green men who live on the planet Pandora, actually that would be big blue people who live on the planet Pandora, in perfect harmony with nature in a paradise designed by Al Gore, if you see people like that up on the planet Pandora, they're fine, okay? I mean, it'll be very interesting, and James Cameron will look like a prophet, but will that somehow throw into question my belief, my personal belief in the God of the Bible? Not in the least. There is nothing in the biblical text that suggests that life cannot exist or does not exist elsewhere in the universe. With all of the advanced physics that people talk about, which really has blurred the distinction between physics and metaphysics, about 9 different universes and sub-universes and inverse universes, and that's fine. If you believe in an all-present, all-powerful creator God, it is possible, as Hamlet said, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. There may be more things out there. Fine, no problem. If, however, it turns out that extensive scientific research suggests that this universe is largely composed of a lot of dead rock, and there is not a scrap of living matter, not a scrap of life anywhere in this whole vast universe except here on planet Earth, then it would be very tough for atheism to survive. And that's the essence of the intelligent design debate. It is the other side that is desperate. We can lose the debate. If there is conclusive proof of Darwinian evolution, in no way does it repeal the notion of a creator God, or of a God who has used the mechanism of evolution and of natural selection to work his will on the planet. There is no debate. There is no contradiction. It is not necessary to reject religious faith if evolution in every Darwinian minuscule matter is proven to be true. It does not rebut belief in God. If, however, it turns out that Darwinian evolution has some questions that cannot be answered, questions about the irreducible complexity of life, of the signature in the cell that Dr. Meyer is going to speak about. If it turns out, in fact, that there is no explanation in purely materialistic science for the creation of life itself, for going from that dead rock to even the tiniest unicellular organism, then atheism cannot survive. Yes, this is a desperate struggle about the belief in God versus the denial of God. But believers are not at risk in this conversation. Atheists are. Deniers are. And that is why you see such a ferocious, fascistic attempt to stifle debate and to stifle free discussion. We are going to have no such fascistic attempt. We're going to have a time after the presentation from each of these distinguished members of the panel. We are going to have a time when you can ask questions, offer challenges, engage in the back and forth that is part of the scientific process. So without further ado, let me introduce a very distinguished gentleman, the director and founder of the C.S. Lewis Society, who is responsible for this evening and for the wonderful program in which we all participated last year. Dr. Thomas Woodward is the author of several books, all of them fascinating. One of them, of course, is Darwinism Under the Microscope with Dr. James Gills. Doubts About Darwin, which won a National Book Award in 2004. His most recent book has been appropriately acclaimed. It's called Darwin Strikes Back. And the one thing, everything about Dr. Woodward is controversial, but there's one thing about Darwin Strikes Back that is not controversial. As Michael Behe has said, and no one has contested him on this book has been called the premier history of the intelligent design movement.
With that, let me introduce Dr. Thomas Woodward.
Appreciate it. It's always fun to be number one in a group of one, huh? We have tonight a lot to cover, and I want to jump right into it. Just a point of clarification, the big tent nature of intelligent design is something that is attractive to me, at least about ID, the theory, the people that are developing theory. And so this is just a slight footnote to what Michael Medved said. Because within this big tent, we have a diversity of points of view. For example, on one side, I won't say if it's the left side, but we have Michael Behe, who accepts common ancestry. He accepts some kind of process through which mankind came from an advanced anthropoid ape or something like that, guided, however, through input from a designer, new genetic input and whatever additional guidance is needed. So you might say, well, he's really a Darwinist. Well, no, because he vociferously and very clearly in his books, Darwin Strikes Back, I slipped of the tongue, doubts, the first book, of course, is Darwin's Black Box, and the follow-up is The Edge of Evolution. Both of those books very clearly set forth the case against accidental, unguided, undirected processes putting together complex entities within a cell. But, again, he accepts at least one side of Darwinian theory. Over here we have, let's say in the middle section, many who would accept the old Earth framework. I think from what I've read, Steve Meyer would clearly be one of those. David Berlinski, a friend of intelligent design, I'm assuming is somewhere in that range. On the other side, Paul Nelson, one of the leading lights of the intelligent design movement, has said, and is very casual about his sharing his perspective, that he accepts a fairly straightforward reading of Genesis. Not based necessarily on the data of science, but based on other lines of evidence. And I would be in that same general camp with Paul Nelson. So we would, would be on let's say another subcategory of design, but all getting along quite well, quite famously, enjoying our stimulating conversations and working together, shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, to advance the scientific case for design. Just wanted to clarify that. Okay, we're into intelligent design theory as it pertains to the origin of life. Let's see if we have some slides here. I'm sure they're coming up momentarily. I guess I need to click? There we go. Mystery of mysteries. How did life begin? I like to think of the current Darwinian, or let's say naturalistic paradigm as a ship. It's a paradigm that has its own way of looking at reality. And this any comparison with the Nina Pinta or Santa Maria is purely coincidental, okay? We're looking about a paradigm then that studies the cell, the Darwinian or naturalistic paradigm, and says, that could have happened through chance, random, stochastic, let's say natural processes. The design theorist, however, looks at certain parts of the cell and sees two massive problems for that theory. One being there is an origin of life problem, and of course that's the subject of tonight, the focus of tonight's discussion. And it was also the focus of Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. How could a blind, undirected process bring about something that is as complex as a computer? As a matter of fact, it looks like a Boeing 747 run by computers, if you want to compare it to a modern entity of fantastic complexity. Secondly, of course, we have complex systems, represented, for example, by the rotary flagellum. Many of you have seen this twirling propeller on the back end of a bacterium in the movie, the documentary film Unlocking the Mystery of Life. And so we would say that that is a second tier, or that's another area of evidence which we believe very strikingly, very strongly points to design. And, of course, Michael Behe, in his presentation of that area, has been open to criticism and has responded at great length and with tremendous detail to virtually every major attack, every critique leveled against his work. If you want to check it out, it's on his Amazon.com blog, connected with his second book, The Edge of Evolution. Fantastic reading. I should require my students, right? Some of your students say, no, you can just leave that for optional. Okay. Now, I want to just jump right into what happened in 1953 in this origin of life area. Stanley Miller, pictured here in his latter part of his career as a chemist working on origin of life problems, used this circulating apparatus. It's the chemical equivalent of a Frankenstein experiment, basically jolting a mixture of simple gases, basically hydrogen, water, methane, and ammonia. And after jolting them with a kind of a rhetorical equivalent of a lightning strike, those products were gathered together, amino acids, and we're going to hold up a model here of amino acids linked to form a protein. And according to the theory, life could have started by chance, by the formation of simple chemical forerunner entities, which then became these complex things called proteins. And then eventually, somehow, DNA runs into the picture. Well, the interesting thing is that the structure of DNA was discovered in 1953, and the Miller experiment was published in 1953. I call that an interesting historical convergence. I don't remember it well. I was 3 years old. Okay? So, but I've read about it, I've studied it, and I think it's fascinating, and I think even the story of the discovery of the structure of DNA is one of the most delightful parts of Steve Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell. So then, the hunt was on, the hunt for the pathway to life. And so I think what we want to see is how hard is it to develop a cell. And I'm limiting myself to about another 6 or 7 minutes, so let's see what we have in a cell. To build a cell, you need, of course, DNA. How much DNA? Well, DNA is quite a complicated molecule. They have a very hard time forming it in just the chemical soup experiments. It actually contains vast amounts of true information. Information, like a computer code, like a headline in the St. Petersburg Times, like a note that you scratch for a family member and leave on the counter telling them what to do before they leave the house. DNA is like a library filled with thousands of tiny books, but instead of calling them books, we call them genes. And of course, the genes are sometimes gathered together in folders. Think of related papers for a project or a course. You keep them in a folder. Well, wow, DNA actually uses folders. We sometimes call these operons, and anything I say that's wrong, I'm sure Steve Meyer will correct me. But so far, so good. He's not turning any dirty looks at this point. DNA also has two companion molecules, RNA and proteins. They also carry information. Now, let me just demonstrate. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Steve, would you help me? I'm asking Steve to assist me in showing off our newest model. One of the things we do at C.S. Lewis Society and at Trinity College is we create models. So that's the top. So hold that up. Everybody see that? Hold it straight up. And I'm going to kind of crouch down, get behind it, because this DNA molecule, let me twist it first. Is that cool? I'm pretty excited about that. But DNA also opens up, so we built it so that each of these double color, and the color code relates to the ATCG, azure tangerine, if you're a gator, any gators here? You know, sometimes known as blue and orange. We call it azure and tangerine because A and T. And then the crimson and green, C and G, the Christmas colors. So that's the adenine and thymine, and the cytosine and guanine, C and G, crimson and green. So I like to think of Gator Christmas, and you got DNA. How about that? Okay. Now, I'm going to twist it up one more time, and I'm going to open it. Okay? And if it's done on the ground, it comes back together quite nicely. So we're using this to model to, again, thank you, Steve. Steve, would you help me with this? That's a DNA. We have protein model. And this is our, Phil, could you help me, Philip? Yeah, we actually commissioned a local artist, a sculptor, working in Oldsmar to create, this is the world's largest protein model. Some of you may have seen it at a conference we held here just a couple of years back. But each of these protein units, they're called amino acids, is a different color. They're 20 hues to represent the 20 letters of the protein alphabet, the amino acids. And the shapes are designed to represent the actual shapes of these constituent chemical letters of a protein. Of course, protein doesn't hang, thank you very much, in the water as it's produced or assembled through the help of DNA, it winds, it scrunches, it twists, it folds, and quickly goes to work in a special 3D shape. I was thinking of having them wind it around my body, but that would look weird, okay? So we'll just go on. At this point, so we've been introduced to DNA, and we've mentioned that there are some letters affiliated with DNA, A and T and C and G in the lower left-hand corner. We also have, of course, the famous RNA molecule. I actually have another molecule where we built an RNA that actually opens along one side or is formed along one side of the DNA. That's the copy. That's the Xerox copy of the gene. And then, of course, the famous folded protein, the 3D structure being shown. I've always thought this looks like a Chinese noodle more than a protein. But we do have a phenomenon here. The phenomenon is this. Just as sentences are made up of strings of letters, so also proteins are precise strings of amino acids arranged like letters on a Scrabble board. And the protein that Steve Meyer and I just held up has 100 letters. That is a short protein. That's a typical short protein. A longer protein, and Steve would be an expert on this, will run to 1,000, sometimes 2,000 letters. Am I correct? Quite commonly. So that protein that we held up would stretch across the room and go down the hallway and perhaps out in the parking lot by the same scale. So proteins are amazing entities. They also wrap together RNA and proteins. Some rather gigantic RNA molecules in the proteins form something called a ribosome machine, which is the wonder of every cell. The wonder machine of every cell. Every cell, bacterial cells, all the way up to your cells, every cell has a ribosome machine which reads that code, that RNA code, turns it into this marvelous protein. It is a translation machine. It's like a machine that translates a line of, let's say, English letters and turns it into the characters of Chinese. What's really cool is then the character string in Chinese then wraps and forms a three-dimensional wonder. Most Chinese sentences don't curl up and form a wonderful machine, okay? So that's the difference between these proteins and ordinary strings of characters. So the ribosome is a marvel. It takes 53 different proteins and at least 2 gigantic, 1,000-letter-long RNA proteins that form the main structural component. So protein words, I mentioned proteins are like long words, like anti-disestablishmentarianism, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, or one of my favorite Hungarian words I learned in a tour of an old Hungarian city called Sopron, is alkokapostacitotalanitotachok, which means y'all didn't make that dish out of wavy leaf cabbage, did you? Somehow, I can't forget that very easily, Michael, so it's wonderful. So let me just show agents put together letters, whether DNA, RNA, or protein letters, in a very simple manner. An intelligent agent is inferred instantly if you see John loves Mary. But in the area of DNA, let's sum up. We have, in a typical message in the sand, let's say 15 letters, we instantly conclude that John or Mary or somebody that wants to bring them together has written that message. Clearwater Beach. Bacterial DNA has 2 million letters typically, some a little bit letters, some a few fewer letters than that. Many of them have many more letters than that, 4 million or more. We jump up to human DNA. We're talking about a 3 billion plus letter hard drive. 3 gigabytes in every one of your 60 trillion cells. You are all sitting here, walking or sitting in this moment, mountains of information. So I think that it's interesting to point out that naturalism's paradigm springs a huge leak. The paradigm, symbolized by the ship, is sinking in front of our eyes. And it's not religious sentiment. It's not, again, biblical issues are hovering nearby. All kinds of philosophical issues are in play. But the evidence that's driving this conclusion is not scientific preference. It's the exact and precise and overwhelming evidence that's pouring out of the information age, which Steve Meyer is now, I think, the leading historian of its development. And so I'm going to close with this quick comment, a connection with C.S. Lewis. I'm going to get myself in trouble, perhaps with some C.S. Lewis fans. Perhaps I'll make you actually excited and very cheered about C.S. Lewis. But if C.S. Lewis were alive today, I am convinced he would be an enthusiastic advocate of intelligent design. Why do I say that? Number one, Lewis's entire writing career was devoted to exposing the flaws the deep, self-contradictory problems and flaws of a philosophy which ruled the university then and still rules it now, called naturalism. It's the view that nature is all that there is, or materialism is another word for it. Matter is all that there is. If nature or matter is all that there is, then all that arises from that matter traces its origin to matter and matter alone. And Lewis said, this view, this philosophy has huge problems, and I need to expose it. He did that in virtually every one of his major writings. Secondly, in 1951, through the influence of a critic of Darwinian theory, Bernard Ackworth, we have the correspondence on there. The article is in our website, C.S. Lewis Society website, which is apologetics.org. C.S. Lewis, privately, in his correspondence, turned away from any acceptance of Darwinian theory in a macro sense. And this is very interesting and relatively unknown, but the evidence for it is quite overwhelming. So I'd like to close by welcoming to the ID fold, in absentia, C.S. Lewis. Thank you very much. And I guess you'll call for responses.
Yes, and it's now my privilege to introduce Professor Lewis. No, don't get your hopes up. He's unavailable, at least on this occasion. Actually, at this point, it is up to Dr. Berlinski or to Dr. Meyer if you have some questions or comments to the remarks just delivered by Dr. Woodward.
Tom, I just wondered if you might explain a little bit more about the Stanley Miller experiment, and you introduced it. And,
yes.
In light of your protein model there, why was his experiment not sufficient to establish that the life had originated from undirected chemical interactions?
Okay. I always use props. Okay. I think you don't mind if I pull this back up. Basically, to form a string, to produce amino acids was problematic given the atmosphere he used. He used an atmosphere that had no free oxygen. Okay, it had the four elements I mentioned. All the experiments that have been done recently, let's say in the last 10 or 15 years, using a more plausible atmosphere, indicated by the deep rock record that we have, those are very different atmospheres. Those atmospheres will not even produce the basic building blocks. Secondly, if you try to form a protein chain, let's say you get all the 20 amino acids and you're ready to go. You have competing, what are called terminator. I always think of Schwarzenegger molecules at this point. Make my day. I may be mixing genres a bit, but
the molecules contain steroids, do they?
Yes, they contain steroids. Yes,
right.
Chemically. So, but there are like ketones and phosphates and other deadly aldehydes that are formed in these experiments. What they do is they cap off the end, and they basically said, "Make my day." That's it. That terminates the protein or the putative growing protein, and the experiments never bring this in, and even textbooks don't even mention a problem with the terminator, cross-reaction with terminator chemicals. Thirdly, all these amino acids have to be a left-handed form. If you're left-handed here, you are blessed, okay, because you're in line with amino acids, all right? So make my day in the area of left-handed amino acids. If you get a right-handed amino acid, it's all over. And there are, in these experiments, an even 50-50 percentage of right-handed and left-handed are produced. A lefty gets in, wonderful. Lefty gets in, wonderful. Righty, we're dead, we're done. It ends the growing protein chain. And the last problem I'll mention, I know I've already done 3 and I'm already over my time, but you have to get the correct order. Yeah, it's not just, let's any old lefty, another lefty, and let's just kind of throw them together and string them together and see what happens. No. The precision of these molecules has been measured in experiments. Sauer's experiment at MIT. The likelihood, they've done this by replacing each one of those units and seeing if it still folds. The likelihood of forming a single short protein, one of this length, is 1 out of 10 to the 80th power. That's 10 to the 80 zeros out of it. So your chances of forming and it's like a miracle just to form one of these things with lefties, and with no terminator chemicals, your chance is 1 out of 10 to the 80th for a short protein. And I think people should realize that to believe in the standard chemical theory of life, you have to have infinitely more faith than you do to believe in an inference to design. I just can't manage the leaps of faith. So that's my quick answer.
So just to clarify, so the Stanley Miller experiment, in effect, synthesized, albeit under not plausible conditions,
atmosphere.
The constituent building blocks.
Yes.
But it didn't arrange the building blocks into the building, or to change the analogy a little bit.
Yeah.
It got the letters, but it didn't arrange them into words and sentences.
And just to make this clear so that everybody knows, why is the Stanley Miller experiment so important? It's important for people who've seen Fantasia, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's idea of a certain age of evolution and the emergence of early life forms comes from Walt Disney's Fantasia. You've all seen the section with the Rite of Spring, and there's a bunch of burbling water, and then there are lightning bolts thwack, and then little unicellular creatures emerge. That's what Dr. Miller was.
I think it's wonderful.
It's wonderful. But the Stanley Miller experiment was trying to affirm that film and that vision of the world, which was 10 years before, is actually plausible.
Exactly, and it forms. I would say it forms a role in education. It has a very important, let's say, symbolic role in public textbooks at the high school and college level, because that experiment, I showed a picture just a moment ago in my slide, that loop of glass carrying those experimental gases, the mixture through the Frankenstein chamber and then back into the trap, that experiment is represented as proof that life can start by random processes. And that is so far off the path of reality, it's almost laughable, because all the major, not some, all the major scientific experts say, oh, yeah, Stanley Miller is basically irrelevant. He just got us going.
So I need you to correct something, if that's the case. Richard Dawkins, Professor Dawkins, recently appeared on my radio show, and in part of our interchange, I believe it was off the air, he was very certain that sometime very soon some researchers would succeed in creating primitive life in a laboratory. Your guess would be that there will be a long wait.
Oh, I mean, how do I say overwhelmingly so? I mean, it would be a long wait to form a single protein. We would wait literally billions of years, to quote Carl Sagan's favorite phrase, billions and billions of years to just get a single protein. Now, once this protein arrives by some stroke of luck, what do? Put it in a little safekeeping jar, kind of freeze it, keep it until you wait for your next miracle. You need a minimum, and now estimate of 250 of these genes. And by the way, these experiments just put together proteins, or the sequential order proteins, leaving that out. They just form the building blocks of proteins. We're not even talking about the building blocks of RNA and DNA, which is a nightmare to produce in any plausible chemical soup, which I even learned more about from Stephen Meyer's book than I ever knew before. And hats off to Steve Meyer.
All right, hats off to Stephen Meyer. Indeed, that of course brings us to the next segment of this program, which is going to be an interchange between Dr. Berlinski and Dr. Meyer. And to introduce Dr. Berlinski in this regard, let me call on somebody else with a doctorate, a medical doctorate, to a local dermatologist of some distinction, Dr. Rob Norman.
Thank you very much. This is exciting. I'm really enjoying this. Dr. David Berlinski, who was featured in the film Expelled, which is outside in the lobby for those of you interested in it, is a native of New York and graduated from Columbia University. His PhD is from Princeton University in philosophy. Having taught at universities in the U.S. and France, he achieved literary renown through his works on the history of mathematics, including the advent of the algorithm, Newton's gift, and the award-winning A Tour of the Calculus. A senior fellow of the Discovery Institute, he has contributed richly to the debate over Darwinism and the new atheism through lectures, numerous essays, and his books, The Devil's Delusion and The Deniable Darwin. As Dr. Berlinski writes in The Devil's Delusion, quote, there may in fact be a connection between the importance of religious belief in life and the existence of the deity in reality. Not a logical connection, no, but a connection nonetheless, and so a clue. And let us be honest, when it comes to clues, we could all use a few more. Here to give us more clues is Dr. David Berlinski. Thank you.
I'm not Dr. Berlinski. I'm Steve Meyer. But I'm going to interview him for two reasons. One, we thought it'd be fun to vary the pace a bit. Three reasons, actually. Secondly, I secretly wish I were Michael Medved. And thirdly, David has a bit of a shoulder injury, and so we're going to allow him to sit down. And, of course, his slouch is now world famous because of Expelled. So we thought we'd put him in the most comfortable and flattering light. David, I'm going to just ask some questions from up here, and we'll get her going. You're not principally known as an advocate of intelligent design. You've been very friendly to those of us who are, but you are principally known for the hard and penetrating questions you've been asking about many theories in mainstream science, and particularly Darwin's theory of evolution. Cool. And in 1996, you wrote a very interesting essay that got a lot of attention in the intellectual magazine Commentary, and that the essay was called The Deniable Darwin. Your new book is a collection of essays, has that as its title. And I just wondered if you could, first of all, tell us how you became skeptical about Darwinism, a little bit of your own history with the issue, and then some of the reasons for your skepticism, which you outlined in that now very, very either famous or notorious essay. Both, yeah.
Both. Sure. Actually, my interest in this question is really of long standing. In the early part of the 1970s, I was playing around with certain ideas, and I just happened to interview Noam Chomsky, the linguist. And we were talking about evolution. At that time, in the early 1970s, Chomsky was very willing to be indignant, almost florid about Darwinism. And he said, the man you really have to see is Marco Schutzenberger in Paris. And Schutzenberger and Chomsky had done a lot of important work in mathematical linguistics together. And Chomsky arranged it, and I went over to Paris. And I sat down with Marco, and we became very close friends. And that was really the beginning of my interest in this question, because Marco Schutzenberger, in addition to being a great mathematician, a very penetrating intelligence, was profoundly skeptical about biology. And he had been a professional biologist, worked in the glorious moment of French intellectual history when people like Jacques Monod had revolutionized our understanding of molecular biology. And he was also, in addition to being a world-famous mathematician, a world-famous physician. So he spoke with a considerable authority about these measures. And we fell into a close friendship, and we decided to explore these issues. And I published my first paper, Journal of Philosophy of all things, trying to ask the question whether certain mathematical models, these were drawn from automata theory, in any way shed some light on questions of change in biology. And this was a very juvenile paper. I don't suggest to you at all that it was a paper of significance, but for one thing, no matter which way Marco and I turned the facts, or turned the theories, or played with the ideas, it became very clear that there was a kind of threshold. Below the threshold were processes which could not really account for anything interesting. Just as in psychology, Skinner's behavioral psychology could not account for anything interesting in learning. And above that threshold, there was a tremendous amount of interesting work. That threshold was precisely the point in which an abstract model began to acquire the properties of a memory. And what occurred to me and what occurred to Marco and certainly other people was, in terms of Darwin's theory of evolution, there is no memory. There is no looking forward or preserving the past in terms of a real memory that can be used sporadically or continuously in order to develop the properties of an organism or a species. That's how I got into it.
So you're thinking about this almost in terms of memory as a concept in in computer science.
That's exactly.
Remember when
right.
I heard you lecture at Yale?
Yeah.
In
automata,
2000,
more general.
You used the memorable phrase, what you need for natural selection to work is something like forward-looking memory.
Yeah.
The ability to...
It's called a push-down storage.
Yeah.
And it has to be there. Because if it's not there, you have a very primitive level of mechanism. And that's how I got interested. Because it's kind of by the back door. It wasn't really addressing the biology, but trying to put together the right kind of model with the facts as I understood them.
And a lot of the early critics of Darwin, and scientific critics that first emerged in the 1960s surrounding that event at the Wistar Institute were MIT physicists and mathematicians and computer
Murray
scientists.
Eden, for example.
Yes, exactly. And why did so many mathematically inclined scientists begin to doubt the Darwinian mechanism? You unpack that a bit with your discussion of the combinatorial problem.
Combinatorial explosion. Well, I think it's important to realize that until about, I would say, 1950, 1960, the mathematicians had not really interested themselves in Darwin's theory of evolution. They're mathematicians, after all, tremendously arrogant and proud of their craft. And biology is a matter of dismal, wet plops. But the moment they began to interest themselves professionally, a very striking number of important mathematicians would say to one another, there's something not right. I mean, mathematically, it's not right. And
was this a question of the odds of generating
these? It's a question
these?
of probability. The phrase that I used was combinatorial explosion. If you think of proteins, as Tom mentioned, and you talk about how many possible proteins there are, of say 250 residues in length, the number is extraordinary, 20 to the 250th power.
You got 20 possibilities at each site, times 20, times 20, times 20, So the natural question that Marco and I were asking, and Noam Chomsky was asking the same question, he has recanted since because of pressure in his academic world, was how did life ever find this very small target amidst this infernal sea of possibilities? And that's where the idea of combinatorial explosion came where the mechanism of natural selection acting on...
Move this over a little bit. Oh, nobody heard a word, huh? There we go. I think we're better.
I thought it was good.
Yeah. Well, just ask the same questions all over again.
So there's this... I love your image here. You've got kind of a sea of possibilities.
Immense.
So 200...
in the paper...
20 times 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 to the 250th power, kind of a number.
Imagine you're on the planet Pluto.
Right.
And you have no idea where you're going. Huge, big, gaseous planet.
You mean Jupiter? Pluto's the little one.
Oh, well, one of the big ones, Jupiter. And you're trying to find a dime.
Yeah.
That's the problem life is facing. You want a dime's worth of integrity amidst an incredible sea of possibilities.
And the mechanism of natural selection and acting on random mutations, though, is essentially blind and undirected.
It has to be.
You're a blind man looking for that dime.
Yeah. It has to be. And I was at the same time, and Marco and I were both very, very suspicious of this Dawkins notion of cumulative selection. It never made the slightest bit of sense to me because the odds don't diminish in cumulative selection as long as a single constraint is in place that changes have to be sequential. They have to come one after the other in the right order. And that's a devastating limitation on Darwinian selection. But I have to say, every mathematician that I've known, John Collarota, Marco Schutzenberger, René Thom, Lippmann Burrs, as soon as the discussion turned to Darwin's theory of evolution, because they were very sophisticated, they recognized the political problems inherent in the discussion. But they all had the same reaction. It's kind of nutty. It's kind of nutty. And that really is my view, too.
But these folks were all biblical fundamentalists, of course.
Absolutely. The last man.
Yeah, it reminds me, what you're saying about the mathematicians reminds me of a conversation I had with Fritz Schaefer, who's been
the chemist.
five times nominated for the Nobel Prize. He's a 1,000 peer-reviewed articles, and his comment was, well, he said, everyone in my field knows that the standards of evidence are somewhat lower in evolutionary biology. You know.
Why does it hurt to admit that? Yeah. I've never understood. The standards are lower, and the field is very different, and that shouldn't be a source of shame or self-reproach. It's a young field. It's only 50 or 60 years old, really. And we're groping. That's the truth. We're really groping. We don't understand most of what we're discovering.
Very interesting. Well, let's change the subject just a little bit. We've been talking. Your initial article was about Darwinian evolution, and that Darwin's specific theory of biological evolution was deniable. It was something that could be doubted. And of course, Darwin attempted to explain how you get fundamentally new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. But there's another branch of evolutionary theory, which is our main focus tonight, and that is sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory,
right.
The attempt to explain the origin of the first life from simple non-living chemicals. And Tom's already talked about this a bit with his discussion of Stanley Miller's experiment, which was meant to demonstrate the plausibility of that theory. But that theory's run into a lot of problems in the ensuing years. And in 2007, you wrote another, and in fact, this second essay, I think, won a number of awards. It was an award-winning essay for your science writing, but it was an essay about this more fundamental problem of how you get life in the very first place. And you, in that article, addressed the I think currently most popular theory,
and still
most popular theory of the origin of life by undirected chemical means, and that was the theory of the RNA world.
Yeah.
Could you explain what the RNA world is and
Sure.
why scientists were, in a sense, impelled to propose this as the explanation?
Let me explain it by means of a thought experiment. Imagine you have an enormous library, thousands upon thousands of books, something that might occur in a short story by Borges. And all of the information that is valuable, treasured, is in the books. And there is no other place to find that information. And the books are on stacks, stack after stack. At the same time, you have a very dedicated cadre of librarians whose only job it is to go to the stacks, find the books, look up the information. That's simple enough as an idea, as a picture. I mean, we can divide the audience, for example, into two groups, the books and the librarians. The librarians take their instructions from the books. The books depend on the librarians to be expressive. This system works by interlocking itself. The librarians depend on the books, and the books depend on the librarians. The question in biology is, how does such a system arise? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. If the books came first, they're useless. If the librarians came first, they have nothing to consult. Plainly, they emerged together in some way. Now, as early as 1967, this was considered the chicken and egg problem, a very significant problem in molecular biology. A very significant problem. Because by 1967 or 1968, the emerging complexity of the cell was already proving so astonishing that it far, far outstripped the resources of any theory. This was a problem that had a partial solution in 1981 when it was discovered by Thomas Scheck and Sidney Altman that in some sense it might be possible. It might be possible, not that it was or is, it might be possible that a long time ago the chicken was the egg. That that separation into a chicken in the form of the nucleic acids carrying all the information in the books.
And that would be the DNA.
The DNA or the RNA.
Yeah.
And the librarians in the form of the proteins, especially the enzymes, was a later development in life. And when they discovered a molecule, a so-called ribozyme, that had both information carrying properties and the ability to execute certain enzymatic functions, the effect was very much like a reverberating thunderclap. Here was the solution to molecular biology's chicken and egg, a molecule that did both. And that was the origin, so to speak, of the RNA world. It's not that DNA came first. It's not that the proteins came first. There was an ancestral form of chemical life in the form of a self-replicating RNA molecule which executed both functions. That's a very dramatic hypothesis. Yeah. Very dramatic.
Very well explained. Brilliant analogy. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because you took that hypothesis head on in your commentary article with a very detailed chemical critique. What are some of the problems? It sounds plausible on the surface. The chicken was the egg, the librarian was the book, but what are some of the problems associated with that hypothesis that life began as a self-replicating RNA molecule?
Yeah, I think it's important to bring out all the problems. I also think it's important to say how much brilliant chemistry has gone into the RNA world. RNA world is kind of the shorthand for the hypothesis. It is certainly no part of my intention, I'm sure it's no part of yours, to in any way denigrate or depreciate the brilliance and inventiveness of the chemistry. Here are the kinds of problems that are involved. Once again, as the mathematicians long suspected, the odds become impossibly long at the beginning when one thinks of what would be necessary even for the creation of a ribozyme. In a ribozyme, in order to admit of Darwinian evolution, has to be self-replicating. If it's not self-replicating, it's just another chemical destined to destruction, sloshing around in the prebiotic broth.
It's got to be able to copy itself.
It's got to be able to copy
sequence
itself.
of genetic instructions that it contains.
Thus, it must be sequence-specific, because self-replication is not a universal property, as mathematicians would say. Very few molecules have the property of self-replication. In fact, we know of only one. But as soon as one consider the odds for even a small self-replicating molecule, we're again in prohibitive terms, 10 to the 80th, 10 to the 100th power. It is very hard to see how, by accident, a self-replicating ribozyme could form. That's one problem. The second problem is, in some sense, that the hypothesis leaves gaping the very point at which we would seek elucidation. If the ancestral ribozyme truly performed both enzymatic and information storage properties, how did it cleave apart so that it became the modern form of information storage in DNA and RNA, and the theater of the proteins at the same time? Once again, the chicken and the egg, having been banished at one level of analysis, emerges clucking and full of vigor at another level of analysis. These 2 points are very considerable. They're very considerable difficulties, and there is a third.
Can I interrupt
Sure,
you?
I'm sorry.
No, I want to hear the third too, but I think it's important to point out that the problems that you just described also relate very intimately with the information problem.
Of course.
Because to get that self-replicating initial molecule, you have to sequence those bases, those little colored beads on Tom's model. He made a DNA model, but RNA is a very similar chemical structure.
Sure.
AM 570 WTVN Pinellas Park and 910 WTWD Plant City. WGUL Dunedin.
Be arranged right, to get the thing to fold right, to have a hope that it would copy itself. And then the second problem you just mentioned is also an information problem, because to convert from that RNA world where you've got the self-replicating RNA molecule, you eventually have the instructions to build all those proteins and the various parts of the modern, what's called the translation system. So
translational apparatus.
Exactly. And all of those pieces, all those biochemical or all those parts in the system have to be constructed with instructions. And so you've got a little information problem and then a big information problem. Even if you can see the RNA world.
Sometimes I think there's only one problem. You can parcel out the problems in various ways, but there's one problem: combinatorial explosion. It's just too many possibilities.
Too many possibilities.
But don't forget, there's a third problem with this whole RNA world hypothesis.
No. Continue.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And that is all of the brilliant chemistry is directed by brilliant chemists.
That was my last question.
And I'm full of admiration for the chemistry, but The fundamental argument that this could have taken place 4 billion years ago, or 3 billion years ago in a prebiotic universe, that remains to be determined. And we do not know. We do not know. And the second you enter into correspondence, as I did with some of these figures, most of them are pretty willing to admit it.
Every advance in the simulation of life-friendly chemistry has come as the result of the guiding hand of the chemist, which is a form of intelligent design.
Without that guiding hand, we don't know whether any of these experiments could be made to work. It's on some very, very fundamental level. One guy had a fantastic experiment showing that a ribozyme could actually cleave itself and then do a little elementary self-replication, but there was no energy source in the experiment. So I wrote to him, where's the ATP? Where's the energy source? They said, well, at that time, because ATP is derived from enzymatic activity, there was none, so I put it in.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Nice question. Thanks.
Dr. Berlinski, quick question before we proceed. You, of course, are well known now as the one of the co-stars of the mega blockbuster Expelled, and also one of your co-stars is Professor Richard Dawkins. You were asking about the brilliant chemists who may have set up these processes. Are you discounting the possibility raised by Richard Dawkins that there may, in fact, have been interstellar visitors who began these procedures 4 billion years ago?
That's an interesting question. You know, it was not Richard Dawkins didn't think of that himself. He got that from Francis Crick, who, as recently as the second edition of the Cold Spring Harbor Symposium on Quantitative Biology, in his preface, he said, this is directed panspermia, it's called. He said, this is a serious hypothesis by elimination. We don't have a clue about any other hypothesis. It's at once an extraordinary conjecture because it's so outlandish, and at the same time an admission of a certain kind of intellectual bankruptcy. Yeah. And I think Steve agrees with me on that.
I do.
Yes, and Steve is actually going to be our next speaker as we move forward. And by the way, if anyone else has a better hypothesis through elimination, you will have your chances in the question period coming right up. Stephen Meyer, I'm proud to say, is my friend. He is my neighbor in Seattle. And he is also a gentleman and a scholar in a true sense. His recent bestseller has helped him to become the Daniel of the Year. He was selected as such by Word magazine, and that's quite a distinction. And he also has been twice on my show discussing his new book, Signature in the Cell. And both times the response has been extraordinary because the material in the book is so challenging at the deepest level, at the worldview level. Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Thank you, Mark.
I should also say, I almost forgot, Stephen is the president of the Center for Science and Culture of the Discovery Institute worldwide, the intergalactic headquarters of Discovery Institute in Seattle.
Thank you. Tom, is there a clicker for the PowerPoint? Yeah. Thanks very much. Well, good evening. It's awfully nice to be here with such a distinguished group of friends and colleagues. I'm going to now try to make the clicker work. And if we have that, we're in good shape. That's not it. Yeah.
You can either click this or click the right they told me.
When I was a college professor, I taught a course on the history of science and technology, and I couldn't operate the VCR. My students detected the same irony. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about my story of my involvement in this. It was fun for me, again, to hear about how David got suspicious, skeptical. I first heard about the problem associated with the origin of life at a conference in 1985. And I had the opportunity, really, I was a young geophysicist. I was working for an oil company in Dallas. and I'd heard about a conference in which the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the problem of the origin and nature of consciousness, all these big issues were going to be discussed. I'd long been interested in the intersection of science and philosophy, the big questions that philosophers address and how they are sometimes illuminated by scientific development. So this was, for me, a must-attend conference. And I was most fascinated having heard the three sessions in the discussion about the origin of life. And I was shocked to find at this conference, having I'd been a science major. I'd double majored in 2 science fields. I was under the impression that the evolutionary biologists pretty much had all the important questions sewn up. And I was shocked to learn that this very fundamental question that we've been discussing tonight, the question of the origin of the very first life, was something for which there was no good scientific answer, no good evolutionary answer, where evolutionary theory is understood to be a theory that attempts to account for the origin of things by reference to purely undirected material processes. Now there was at this conference scientists, in a sense, on 2 sides of the aisle. Scientists who were committed materialists who acknowledged that they didn't have any explanation, as Professor Dawkins did at the end of the film Expelled, when Ben Stein probed and asked him about the origin of the very first life, and Dawkins very candidly said, quote, "No one knows how life first began." So there were at this conference scientists of that persuasion, materialists, committed materialists, who were candid about acknowledging the impasse that had arisen in the field of origin of life research, as it's called. On the other side of the panel, there were scientists who were deeply skeptical about the standard chemical evolutionary explanation for the origin of life, but who were beginning to entertain the possibility that maybe something else beyond matter had played a role. They didn't quite know what to call it. They didn't call it intelligent design at that point. They talked in sort of muted tones about the possibility of intelligence or intelligent cause having played a role. Well, I listened to the exchange between these 2 sides, and I was, as the British say, gobsmacked. It rocked my world. What was interesting was that everyone agreed that the field was at a state of impasse. There wasn't a good explanation. But what got really interesting was when Dr. Charles Thaxton, whose picture you see on now I'm going to find the quote, there he is, floated this idea that the information in the DNA molecule may in some way owe its origin to an intelligent cause. He thought there was an intuitive connection between intelligence and information. Well, it got very hot at that point, and the scientists coming back from the other side began to question his parentage, his intelligence, and virtually everything else. And I thought this was a science conference. It was getting very emotional, so it got my attention. Now, I later learned to call the mystery that all of the scientists on the panel were acknowledging the DNA enigma. Because it turns out that the fundamental mystery that these origin of life researchers had been unable to solve was the question of the origin of the information that's encoded along the spine of the DNA molecule. I used to ask my students when I was a college professor, if you want to give a computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And I'm sorry, Professor, I'm going to ask you, well, obviously the answer is you have to give it code, you have to give it software, you have to give it information. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, or if you want to build life in the first place, you have to account for the critical informational endowments, in particular of the DNA molecule and its RNA copy. Where did that information come from? You have to have that information in order to do all the things that the DNA does. What it does is it provides instructions for building the proteins and the protein machines that perform all the important metabolic functions inside cells. So that DNA enigma it seemed to me to be a profound mystery. It was a mystery at the heart of the problem of the origin of life. I got fascinated with it, and I was fortunate enough to meet Dr. Thaxton after the conference. It just so happened that he lived in Dallas. I had been doing some science writing. We began to meet late after work hours, talk about the problem more. A year later, I was off to Cambridge, England, and I had a research topic. Had become fascinated with this. Now, of course, this turned out to be a very good place to go to study, because the DNA enigma, in many ways, first arose because of the pioneering work of James Watson and Francis Crick at Cambridge University. they were able to elucidate the structure of DNA in 1953 and showed that the DNA molecule, which more and more scientists were suspecting was the key to hereditary information, had this beautiful double helix structure that we all know and love. It's a cultural icon now, the beautiful double helix. But what was important about the DNA molecule was not so much just its shape, as beautiful as it is. When Watson and Crick, when Crick in particular saw the double helix structure arising as they worked out the chemistry with their models, he was quoted as saying, "It's so beautiful, it has to be right." But in addition to the aesthetic beauty of the shape, the most important thing about the DNA molecule is that it is an information carrier. And this first became clear in 1957 when Francis Crick proposed what's known as the sequence hypothesis. This, I think, was the most brilliant insight in modern molecular biology. It created the ensuing molecular biological revolution, and the insight was a very simple but profound one. And that is that along the spine of the DNA molecule, there are 4 chemicals represented with the alphabetic letters A, T, C, and G on the diagram on the screen. There are 4 chemicals that function. They literally function just like alphabetic characters in a written language or like digital characters, the zeros and ones we use in machine code. That is to say, it's not the chemistry, the chemical properties of these chemical constituents of the DNA molecule that matter to its function. Instead, what matters is the precise sequential arrangement of those chemicals that function as characters, such that the molecule is able to convey instructions or information for building those intricately shaped protein molecules that do all the important jobs in the cell that we've been talking about. So what we have in the cell is something very much like what we have at the Boeing plant in Seattle, which we sometimes call, which engineers recognize, called CAD/CAM, Computer-Assisted Design and Manufacturing, where you have digital code directing the construction of mechanical parts. In the cell, the code is directing the construction of the proteins and protein machines. In an airplane factory, it might be directing the placement of rivets on an airplane wing or something of that sort. So we have a high-tech digital information technology running the show inside life. Now, I've got a little tiny piece of animation that shows that first of all, that Crick's insight was right. The sequence hypothesis was subsequently confirmed, and what scientists learned was that the digital code in the DNA molecule is directing the construction of these protein parts. And we're going to have a look at this with a piece of animation now that is just mind-blowing when you begin to realize what's actually going on. The animator here has highlighted the chemical bases, the nucleotide bases as they're called, showing the digital character of those information-carrying bases. This is the double helix with a large protein complex called a polymerase attached to it, and there's another view of that same polymerase. The polymerase is now going to separate the 2 strands of the DNA to allow it to be copied to produce a single-stranded messenger RNA transcript, a copy of the information on the DNA, and that messenger RNA is going to be the polymerase will spit it out when it's all copied. Now we have a copy of the original DNA instructions. Those will be transported out of the cell and passed through an information recognition device called the nuclear pore complex that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell nucleus. And that strand of information is now going to go out to the ribosome that we were talking about before, that Tom was mentioning, and it's going to thread in between the 2 parts of it. And at the ribosome site, which is essentially a factory now for producing the protein machines, the information in the RNA copy of the DNA is going to, in a very mechanical way, direct the construction of the protein. Each one of these little adapter molecules called transfer RNAs are bringing in exactly 1 amino acid corresponding to a sequence of 3 nucleotide bases. And so the information on that RNA strand is going to direct the construction of the protein amino acid by amino acid. And you see the protein at the bottom of the screen coming off as the spent message text floats out to the top. So that's a kind of cartoon, simplified version of how the digital information inside the DNA is directing the construction of the proteins and the protein machines that we need to stay alive. Now, that brings us back to our question of the night, which I like to call the DNA enigma. The DNA enigma is not the question of the structure of the DNA molecule. That was amply elucidated by Watson and Crick. It was a brilliant scientific breakthrough. I have nothing but the highest respect for the genius that was involved in coming to that discovery. But that's not the mystery that has afflicted origin of life research for more than 50 years. It's not even the mystery of where the information in DNA resides. We know where it resides. It resides along the spine. That was the sequence hypothesis that Francis Crick put forward. The DNA enigma is not even the mystery of what the information does. We have also, or the great molecular biologists of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s have figured that out as well. And the animation that I just showed you is, in a sense, a visual encapsulation of the brilliant work of labs on both sides of the Atlantic for well over 10 to 15 years. Just a period of great scientific genius. It made that possible, that knowledge possible. Now, instead, the DNA enigma is a different and more fundamental question. And it's the question of where that information came from in the first place. That's the question that has not been answered by reference to undirected chemical evolutionary processes since 1953. And it is an irony, as Dr. Woodward has pointed out, that just as the origin of life research community, the evolutionary biology community, was getting more excited, they were at a point of their highest optimism with the Stanley Miller experiment, something else was discovered that same year, which would ultimately unravel our confidence that life arose through a purely undirected process. So this DNA enigma is essentially the problem of the origin of biological information. And here we have one of the leading origin of life researchers acknowledging this fundamental mystery. He says the problem of the origin of life is basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of that all-important information in the DNA molecule. Now, when I first encountered Dr. Thaxton, I learned very quickly about, by that time, this was the mid-'80s, how many failed attempts there had been to explain the origin of that information. This was before the RNA world hypothesis had really become popular. But as we've just been discussing, even the more recent attempts to explain the origin of life and the origin of information that it would require have foundered. I'm referring to the RNA world. That also has an information problem. And as I did more research, both as a PhD student and then since, I've learned that every attempt to explain the origin of life has come up against this point of impasse. There's a stumbling block, and the stumbling block is the problem of the origin of information, the DNA, or we could even say the RNA enigma, because getting a self-replicating RNA molecule going also requires information. So where does that information come from? Well, I was aware of the depth of the problem as I was heading off to graduate school in 1986. And I continued to investigate that, but I had a burning question in the back of my mind. I knew from talking to Dr. Thaxton that he thought there was an intuitive connection between information and intelligence, that intelligence seemed typically to be the cause of information. And I began to wonder if that intuitive notion of an intelligent cause having something to do with the information that we saw in life couldn't be developed into a rigorous scientific argument. If we could go beyond just intuitively plausible to something that had the rigor of a scientific case. In fact, of the kind of case that Darwin had made in The Origin of Species. And so there again, I was fortunate to be in Cambridge because that's where Darwin had been. And I immediately began to investigate his work. How did he construct a scientific case for his ideas about the origin of species? And I discovered that he had used a method that made perfect sense. My question was this: how could the design hypothesis be made into a rigorous scientific argument? And so I began to study the work of Charles Darwin. And I learned that he, along with his scientific mentor, Charles Lyell, the great English geologist, had pioneered a scientific method for studying events in the remote past. We're not talking about laboratory science here, laboratory experimental science where you're repeating things under controlled conditions. We're talking about trying to figure out the causes of events that took place a very long time ago. And Darwin used a method of scientific reasoning that's used commonly in historical sciences, in the earth sciences, and even in other sciences like theoretical physics. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or sometimes called the method of inferring to the best explanation. And in the short quotation, Darwin expresses his allegiance to this way of doing science. I became fascinated with this, and the method seemed to be commonsensical enough. I'd already encountered it in some of my work as a geophysicist. It's a method that geologists and geophysicists learn as well, and it's very simple. If you want to explain an historical event, a natural historical event, so something in the remote past, you want to propose all the possible causes for that event that you can think of, and then you want to one by one evaluate them, and through a process of elimination, elect the cause which provides the best explanation. Now, that obviously begs a little bit of a question, and that is, well, how do we know what constitutes the best explanation? If the method is inference to the best explanation, it doesn't help just to say we want to find the best. We want to know what are the criterion what is the criterion by which we determine the best explanation. Well, it turns out that the biologists and geologists using this method had a very practical criterion that they used to assess which explanation is best, and it makes perfect sense. Lyell first pioneered it, but I can illustrate it very quickly. If you're in eastern Washington, where I used to teach, and you go out into the Palouse country, and you find a layer of volcanic ash, you have a couple different possibilities for explaining the origin of that layer. It might be the result of a volcanic eruption, the volcanic eruption hypothesis, or it might be the result of an earthquake. Which of the two is better? Well, according to Lyell, the theory that's better, that was Darwin's mentor, is the one that points to a cause which is known to produce the effect in question. And since we know that volcanoes produce volcanic ash, and we know that earthquakes, or don't have any evidence of earthquakes doing the same, the volcanic eruption hypothesis is a better explanation. And Lyell captured this insight, and there's some specialized terminology in the subtitle of his book, where he said that geology was an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface, and this was the phrase that knocked my socks off. He said, by reference to causes now in operation. What we're looking for is a cause which we know from our present experience is capable of producing the effect that we're trying to explain. A cause now in operation. When I saw that phrase, I asked myself a question. What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital code? What is the cause that we know from our uniform and repeated experience, another part of Lyell's dictum, the basis of all scientific reasoning, what is the cause that we know that's capable of producing functional information? I realized there was only one. All these failed attempts were telling us something, but there was something else telling us something, and that was our ordinary experience. We know from experience that information is always produced from intelligent causes. There was an information scientist, in fact, who I was reading at the time, Henry Quasler, a pioneer in the application of information theory to molecular biology. And in an offhand, somewhat candid moment, he said, information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And I thought, yes, that's absolutely right. And so as I began to think about this more, I realized that if we use Darwin's method of reasoning and his key principle of reasoning, that we should be looking for causes known to produce the effect in question, it was possible to formulate a rigorous scientific argument for the idea of intelligent design. Now, Bill Gates, the other local hero that we have in the Seattle area besides Michael Medved, has said something very suggestive. He says that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any we've ever created. And now this is, of course, a very suggestive remark, because we know from our uniform and repeated experience that programs always come from programmers, not from wind and erosion or other undirected processes. In fact, one day I was standing on the soccer sidelines for watching my daughter play soccer a couple of years ago, and she had a kind of a gruff coach that I took to be, a big dumb jock, basically. Well, it turned out I was wrong. He's the elite level programmer at Microsoft, and he walked over to me one day on the sidelines. He leans into me and he says, I had no idea he even knew what I did. He leans into me and he says, so what do these Darwinists think? The code just wrote itself? And then he paused and he says, not at Microsoft. So in any case, we know, again, from experience, that programs always come from programmers. We know more generally, following the Henry Quastler dictum, that information in whatever form we find it does habitually arise from an intelligent source, and indeed from only an intelligent source. Whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a headline on a newspaper or a paragraph in a book or a Shakespearean sonnet or information embedded in a radio signal, information always arises from an intelligent source, from a mind, not a material process. And so the discovery of digital code along the spine of the DNA molecule, also expressed in the RNA molecule, is powerful evidence of a designing intelligence. If there is one and only one known cause of a given effect, the presence of the effect points powerfully and logically back to the existence of that cause. Since intelligence is the only known cause of information, it's a valid and logically strong inference to conclude that it had a designing mind responsible for it. And so that's the argument that I developed in Signature in the Cell. I just explained it in about 20 minutes. It took me rather longer in the book, but there's a lot of different aspects to the argument, and certainly a lot of objections to respond to. One of the things that I did very self-consciously in developing the argument in the book is I used Darwin's method, the method of multiple competing hypotheses, and I examined different attempts to explain the origin of life, some based on chance, some based on necessity, or what scientists sometimes refer to as natural laws, some that combine the two, and then finally I looked at intelligent design. So to use the method of inference to the best explanation, you necessarily have to keep an open mind and take on all comers and evaluate all the possible hypotheses and explanations that have been proposed, and that's one of the reasons the book is fat. I evaluated each of the contending explanations and the categories of explanation that have been offered since 1953 to account for the DNA enigma. But as the result of my investigations, I've concluded that what we know now, based on now nearly 60 years of prebiotic chemical simulation experiments, is that the only known cause for the origin of information is intelligence, and therefore that is the best explanation. Now, just to highlight that a little in closing, I made the balance of my case for intelligent design and Signature in the Cell based on what you might call molecular biology 101. Very now basic things that we have known since the 1950s and 60s. That we've known it for a while does not make the case any less strong, because though we know what the DNA does and how it expresses information, again, no one had been able to account for the origin of that information. But in the back part of Signature in the Cell, in the last third of the book, I look at some things that have been learned recently in molecular biology, in genomics, and other related fields. And there I think the case for intelligent design gets even more exciting. I have another programmer friend in our area. With these Microsoft techies are all over Redmond and Woodinville, where we live and have our kids in school. And one of them retired from Microsoft a couple years ago to come work with us for a couple years. Retirement means like you're 38 or something, And it's a brilliant, 6 feet 5 inches tall, just oozed intelligence. Very well spoken. Again, an elite level architect at Microsoft. He came to write 10,000 lines of code for us, so we could, in a computer program, simulate that gene expression system that I showed in the animation and do experimental tests of what mutations can and can't do over 4 billion years of biological history. A fascinating tool that's been developed at our lab, the Biologic Institute. One day, my programmer friend walks into my office and he tosses a book on my table, and then he says something I'll never forget. He says, "I get an eerie feeling that someone figured this out before us." And I said, "What do you mean?" And the book that he put on my table was called Design Patterns. And a design pattern, as computer software people here will know, is a technical term, a term of art for a design strategy or design logic that has been used repeatedly to solve certain kinds of problems, in particular problems in the processing of information, if you're a software person. Now, inside the cell, in addition to the information in the one-dimensional array along the spine of the DNA molecule, there is, as Dr. Berlinski has indicated, a complex information processing system where the protein machines are involved in reading and expressing that information, which in turn codes for the building of those same protein machines. Now, my colleague, the Microsoft programmer, said to me something. He said, I get an eerie feeling someone figured this out. I said, before us, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, as I'm learning the molecular biology of the cell in order to write the code to simulate what's going on inside the cell, he said, I'm discovering that the very same design patterns are at work in the information processing system inside life as we are just coming to in modern high-tech digital computing. We have, he said, in the cell, there's a spell check. There's a system that ensures the fidelity of the replication of the genetic information, and if something goes awry, it quickly backs up, recopies it, and corrects the mistake. He said, inside the cell, there is a design pattern for essentially the storage of information in a hierarchical manner. We have a hierarchical filing system on our desktop computer where we have files within folders, folders within superfolders, superfolders within super-duper folders. And interestingly, modern genomics has revealed the same thing about life, that there is a hierarchical way of organizing information inside life. There's a system for the distributive storage and retrieval of informational modules that are used repeatedly on a needs basis. And those modules are accessed by something like an operating system that is actually embedded in what Darwinists used to think was the junk DNA portion of the DNA molecule. One of the arguments that you will hear, in fact, is still being made, it was made as a critique of my book, which made me realize the reviewer didn't read it, by Francisco Ayala, is that intelligent design isn't it's a failed scientific theory because no intelligent designer would build all that junk DNA into the DNA molecule. Well, it turns out those non-coding regions of the DNA molecule, the parts that don't code for building proteins, perform many important functions, and overall they function together like an operating system that directs the timing and expression of the other information stored in DNA. So you go right down the list of all these different design patterns, and my colleague had a kind of intuitive reaction to what he was learning as a programmer. He intuitively recognized the genius of another programmer. And in fact, he said, it's just like, we have all the same design patterns, except it's like, and then he went to Microsoft talk, it's like an 8.0, 9.0, 10.0 version of the things that we have recently developed, and it is the same basic logic, but executed with an elegance beyond anything that we've yet imagined. So that's the kind of thing we're dealing with. That's an intuitive reaction, but I would also submit it's a very logical reaction, and one which adds to the case that I've made for intelligent design, because, again, we know of only one known cause for the origin of these kinds of design patterns, and that cause is, again, intelligence. So that's my case for intelligent design in a nutshell, and you can read more about it and learn more about it as we talk. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of the participants. And now is the moment you have been waiting for, where you can pose your own questions and challenges. And I believe we have microphones.
Yes, there are going to be 2 microphones
that are going to be circulating around the room.
Dr. and Mrs. Charles Lashley, I think, have the microphones.
Dr. and Mrs. Charles Lashley. So if you know the Lashleys, you can find them.
Yes, they're here somewhere in the audience, I believe, with the microphones ready to go. And so I guess we can begin.
Sure. And by the way, let me say, I would like to try, with the permission of Dr. Woodward, let us follow the sacred traditions of the Michael Medved radio show and privilege any questions or challenges for people who have a great deal of difficulty with the arguments for intelligent design that have been posed tonight. Because unlike certain partisans on this debate that we could name, there is no eagerness to avoid confrontation or argument, and or to foreclose free exchange of ideas. And maybe just very quickly, it's something that was striking me, and I would ask Dr. Meyer or Dr. Berlinski or Dr. Woodward. We've heard a great deal tonight about scientific discoveries, particularly in the 1950s, with the nature of DNA and genomics and RNA, all of which suggest intelligent design, all of which suggest that there is a deeper complexity, what has been called an irreducible complexity, that could not be entirely random or entirely materialistic. Meanwhile, we hear in conventional wisdom that all of the scientific discoveries of recent times, certainly the last scientific discoveries of the last 100 years, have argued against the idea of a creator God or of a intelligent designer. Can you, giving the other side its due, talking about the devil's delusion, as David Berlinski would have it, of the recent scientific discoveries of the last 100 years, which would be the most persuasive in arguing against the possibility of an organizing intelligence to the universe?
David?
Are we waiting for the audience? Or?
Yeah, no, quickly.
Oh, sure.
The whole idea of intelligent design, speaking as the devil's advocate, rests on an analogy that we can suitably explain the origins of information because we have suitably explained rather mundane activities in which the origins of information are perfectly clear. That is, the day-to-day activities of which Professor Stephen Meyer spoke. Nonetheless, I would argue that, in fact, the analogy is fatally flawed from the beginning, because that which is supposed to provide the powerful explanation is every bit as mysterious as that which it is supposed to explain. If we were truly in possession of an analogy, we would understand what it means for human beings in the daily concourse of life to build things, impart information, create new structures, supervise the emergence in the universe of novelties of all sorts. We would understand free will, because these are acts of choice. We would understand intentionality. We would understand how we supervise the passage from an intellectual world, that is a world of immaterial thoughts, to a world of concrete achievements. And in none of those cases do we have even a glimmer of understanding scientifically what's going on. Thus, I would argue that in order to sustain the doctrine of intelligent design, the analogy itself must be purged of its flaws. And for the moment, in 2010, I see no way of accomplishing the suitable purge.
Dr. Woodward.
Well, the argument presented by Francis Collins in his book, and I'll just use him as typical, both a theist, he's a robust Christian theist, as he explains in his book, The Language of God, and his chapter on intelligent design, which I was very disappointed with, if I can be so blunt and polemical. His chapter on intelligent design had many flaws, many problems, but he did argue, I thought, one interesting thing. He said that the existence of, well, not junk DNA, but pseudogenes, parallel mistakes in, let's say, a chimp and a human genome, argued for common ancestry, and I guess by implication in his mind, the random Darwinian process. I would argue that you could make a case for common ancestry, if I can reply to Francis Collins. I don't think you can make a case for the random, naturalistic origin of that information in the first place. I think they're good answers to his argument, but I think it only carries to, let's say, the first level of common ancestry. It doesn't carry on to the naturalistic origin of the information in the first place.
Dr. Meyer.
You want me to offer another devil's advocate position?
Yes. What would be, of the recent scientific discoveries, and again, recent meaning the last 100 years, every clever high school atheist, and you know this, says that the recent discoveries of science, meaning going back to the turn of the century, all make religious belief impossible. Everyone here has heard this 1,000 times. So what would be the most persuasive scientific discoveries that would make it difficult to impute the existence of an intelligent designer?
Maybe the examples that can be offered of bad design are puzzling to people. Why there's been a common argument about the design of the vertebrate retina, that it has a blind spot, and because of the way it's wired, and there's a nerve in the giraffe that seems to take a very circuitous route that no one can discover a functional reason for. So there's a class of evidences that the Darwinists will often offer that putatively show bad design because there's not a clear functional logic for them, or at least not one apparent to us.
Terrific. All right. Questions. Let me see. Where do we have the questioners? And please, no speeches. We will invoke cloture. We have 41 votes. Actually, you'd use 41 votes to block cloture. So we have more than 59 votes in order to invoke cloture. So go ahead.
I'm Dr. Jordan. I'm not going to ask a scientific question, but the question is, why does the other side feel so threatened?
Why does the other side feel so threatened? Does someone want to take that on? It's my wife who is the clinical psychologist, so and she's not here.
I could speak to that without necessarily conceding the premise of the question, because I don't know that we can impute motive to people's reactions, but you certainly can characterize the reactions, and sometimes they are indeed very hostile, and sometimes a fair bit irrational. As evidence of that, just go to Amazon and look at some of the reviews of our books. But we have a friendly debating partner on the other side of the issue that several of us have encountered a number of times, Michael Ruse. And Professor Ruse has written an important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned for many scientists as a kind of secular religion. It's not just a scientific theory. It's the basis of an all-encompassing worldview. And like all of us, when deeply held beliefs are challenged, especially by evidence and arguments that we find hard to answer, we sometimes respond in a less measured way than we might. And I think that's behind some of the reaction, that there are deeply held metaphysical issues in play, and some of the arguments that have been put forward tonight and in other places are definitely providing a very strong challenge to that belief system.
Hi, I want to say I'm very impressed with your presentation of these things. I kind of had similar thoughts when I was taking a biology course recently. But, I mean, if you take the approach that you assume that there is no intelligence in the universe, then would this not be the death of intelligence? And we could simply say that computer programs, everything that we create in the world is just a random process, because we are a random process.
You can certainly say it.
Next question. We do want to keep this. Dr. Woodward, did you want to address that?
I'd chime in on that one.
Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think the questioner points out one of another profound mystery, which is the nature of consciousness, which David was alluding to a minute ago. This is every bit as profound a mystery as the origin of life, and there are in the disciplines like cognitive science and philosophy of mind, and the attempt to simulate conscious experience with the whole program of artificial intelligence. I think there is a growing recognition that this is a profoundly, perhaps even insoluble problem. We don't really know how we get from the chemistry of the brain to my experience of red or blue as I look out into the audience, and as people tried to simulate what a computer could do. It's a computer to simulate consciousness. The same kind of problem came up. How do you get from a series of zeros and ones to the experience of green? There's a fundamental chasm here. So I think when we begin to talk about intelligence, we know that we know because of our own introspective experience of what it means to be a conscious agent. We know that we have certain what philosophers call causal powers, the ability to affect the world around us as a result of our deliberative choices. But we don't, as David alluded to, we don't really know how mind affects matter. That's a profound and fundamental mystery. It means we don't have a complete account of reality, but it also means the attempt to explain everything away in materialistic terms is a profound superstition, and one that has made no progress since these questions began to be addressed.
Let me add to that it's quite true we don't know how mind affects matter, but we also don't know how matter affects matter.
Bill Hunter. I have
with, for example, universal gravitation.
It's a profound mystery at a distance. I'm sorry.
No. Sorry. So my question, the first part's sort of rhetorical, and the second part is amusing. The rhetorical part is before Watson and Crick, we had no idea how proteins were synthesized specifically, and the information of how to do it was passed on from generation to generation. Is it possible that this mystery of where this information, how the information gets in the DNA, is just awaiting the next Watson and Crick? And then the musing is some of the more recent mathematics. I saw Stuart Kaufman's name up on a slide, and he had an expression he calls complexity for free. And I'm wondering how some of the self-organizing nonlinear systems and so on, does that offer any hope for a better explanation than 19th century combinatorics?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we appreciate the self-organizational theorists in part because they've been very candid about the problems of neo-Darwinism. They appreciate the combinatorial problem that David spoke about. I addressed Stuart Kaufman's work in one of the chapters in my book, and it's an interesting illustration of the incorrigibility of this information problem. Every attempt to solve it either fails if the solution is attempting to rely on purely undirected materialistic processes, or if it succeeds, invariably the successful solution to the problem has had the hidden hand of intelligence guiding it in some way. And in Kaufman's work, he talks about a chemical minestrone, of simpler chemicals that auto-catalyze a metabolic system. They just bypass the whole need for DNA and get right to the whole interdependent system of DNA and proteins. And he acknowledges, however, even in theory, there's no evidence that such a thing has or could have happened, but even in theory, he acknowledges that to have that autocatalytic step ensue, that there would have to be a very particular configuration of all the small molecules in that chemical soup, which is another way of talking about information, actually, that you have to specify the positions and arrangements of the constituent parts of the soup. So what he does to solve the information problem at the higher level is he derives the information by presupposing it in the soup. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's legitimate to begin to talk about design, intelligent design, is the best explanation. Science doesn't leave questions open indefinitely. We have to always be open to new information and revising theories, but there is a point when we begin to learn something, that nature is talking. We have in physics conservation laws that tell us not only what does happen, but also what doesn't happen. And what, after repeated attempts and thousands of years of repeated scientific attempts and thousands of years of ordinary human experience, I've concluded that what we know is that information always arises from an intelligent source, and even the attempts to refute that end up inadvertently illustrating it. For example, with these RNA world experiments, where the ribozyme engineer is actually doing all the important work of sequencing the molecules to get them to perform limited self-replication. So it can't get the intelligence out of the successful information generation. That's something nature is teaching us, and therefore I think it's fair to make some conclusions on that basis.
Okay, let me say that just to give people a heads up on our proceedings, we are going to conclude this program and adjourn for signing books and
we're going
conversation.
We're going to 9:30.
Yes, we will let people know that we will be done at 9:25.
Yeah. Okay.
Very, very sharply,
Okay,
so that people do not need to worry about. There recently were some public events where the speakers, I'm thinking of last night actually, where the principal speaker went on at prodigious length, and we're hoping not to emulate that long day's journey into night. Yeah. So there will be a prompt conclusion at 9:25.
And if I could supplement just real quickly, if we could have this group of people just move to the front, would that be okay? Over here, line up across the stage, like right by the step. That way that we can have people there viewing the panel. I think you're okay in the back.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
In the back there. Next question.
Information theory states that information only exists when there's a sender and a receiver. Is that correct?
David? I didn't quite hear it. Information
only exists when there's a sender and a receiver.
Are you talking about Shannon's theory?
I'm not sure which theory it is.
No, I think that is unnecessarily stringent. Information supposedly is part of the broad and noble class of measurable properties. For example, in physics, you talk about information, the information horizon of a black hole, or the information content of a black hole. It's not necessarily the case that a black hole is a sender of information, although metaphorically those terms can be applied. No, I think the idea of a sender, a recipient, and even a channel of communication are not really of the essence. So what is of the essence in information theory, whether you're talking about Shannon information or Kolmogorov-Chaitin information, is the measurable property itself.
Yes, Mary.
Dr. Meyer, Dr. Berlinski gave an earlier illustration of the librarian in the book, and at some point it was discovered that at one point they were both in the same. What are your thoughts about, you talked about the programmer and the code, that at some point the code and the programmer are the same?
Yeah, his illustration was a way of explaining what's the proposal of the RNA world people, that they want the information in the DNA molecule corresponds to the books, the proteins corresponded to the librarians accessing the books so they could be read. The proposal of the RNA people was that RNA, the molecule which stores the copy of the DNA molecule, can sometimes, there was a discovery that it can sometimes function to do some of the things that proteins can do. It can catalyze certain reactions. And in my book, I have a whole chapter critiquing that now cutting-edge origin of life theory. And in addition to the problems that David and I already talked about, that it turns out just to get an RNA molecule that can copy itself requires a prodigious amount of information. We haven't even been able to do that in a laboratory yet. At best, scientists working on this have been able to synthesize a molecule which can copy about 10% of itself. But even then, as all the important work of sequencing the molecule to get it to perform this function is done by the ribozyme engineer, by the scientist himself or herself. There are other problems. It turns out that the true enzymes, which are what proteins are, true enzymes, can do an interesting job. They can couple chemical reactions that can couple energetically favorable and unfavorable reactions together in a two-part reaction sequence which reactions would not occur on their own. RNA doesn't actually work as a true enzyme that can do that work of coupling. It's more of a small molecule catalyst. And so even the capacity of the RNA molecule that made people think that the librarian in the books could be the same, or the librarian in the books could be the same, it really can't be the same. It doesn't do all the important work of a true protein. So there's lots and lots of problems with this. I outline them in my book, and I commend it to you.
It's a very interesting question, though. There are 2 points that really don't receive suitable notice. One, since 1981, when ribozymes were first understood and discovered, no one has asked, to my mind, the obvious question: is there another interpretation? They're now being treated as relics buried in deep time of a period in the history of life in which divisions were not divisions, had not yet been rent asunder. I haven't seen one essay in the literature discussing another conjecture. For example, the ribozymes might be a very powerful expression in the cell of the fact that the cell mathematically is compact, that it has a backup system in case the division between the DNA and the enzymes fails in some way. I don't know why that's not at least a reasonable hypothesis. The second thing is, if you spend an hour at a library and go through any of the journals of molecular biology dealing with origins of life, you go to the second or third paragraph, obligatory in terms of editorial standards, is a paragraph heading preparations for the experiment. And there are inevitably pages and pages of detailed chemical instructions about the enzymes needed to make the experiment work.
AM 570 WTBN Pinellas Park and 910 WTWD Plant City. WGUL Dunedin.
Which themselves require endless number of enzymes. It's an interesting and instructive exercise.
Yes, in the back.
If evolution is improbable because of the complexity of biology, then is not the greater complexity of God even more improbable?
Can I tackle that?
No.
Since I'm in the Zacchaeus group and not about a foot shorter than Steve Meyer will stand, the implication, and of course this is straight from Richard Dawkins' various points he's made in his books, that if explaining life is difficult, then explaining this far more complex being, the deity, let's say, as the most likely candidate, and in my view, the real designer, then that's a greater problem. I think that's what's behind the question. It's a good question. It's an interesting question, at least. What it implies then is that you can compare the complexity of a code with the complexity of the designer of the code. Well, that assumption is far from valid, or shown valid at least, because it's like saying I can compare my essay that I wrote for University of South Florida working on my PhD with me. I mean, it's a straight comparison. Okay, now, yes, the complexity of the deity by definition would be greater in all probability. But then that's, to say that you therefore must explain the origin of the author by some simple method, and I think that's lurking behind the question, that is the most implausible thing that we can ever assume, you see, because it is far from proven that the author of any text has a simple origin, you see. That's a faith construct. It's a leap of faith, if you will. And of course, Dawkins loves to talk about the creator problem by saying, who made the creator? That's like saying, how square is your circle? You see, that's like saying, what is the color of sweet? It's mixing completely irrelevant or at least unrelated terms, because the creator, by definition, by all Judeo-Christian and Islamic definitions, the creator is the transcendent, that is metaphysically beyond the universe, origin of everything, the uncreated, not self-created, uncreated being. So to say, who created the uncreated being, well, it hardly merits a response.
Michael, could I add something? I just wanted to add something quickly to that answer. I addressed the who designed the designer objection in the latter part of my book. David does as well, I think, in Devil's Delusion. But the way I respond to that is that in every worldview or metaphysical system of thought, there is something assumed to be the what philosophers call a primitive, or the prime reality, the thing from which everything else comes. And so any metaphysical system ultimately gets to that starting point. At that point, you can still say, well, you can say, who created God, or from where did matter come? Who evolved the evolutionary process? How did the evolutionary process itself evolve? The ability to ask one more question of your foundational explanatory principle does not negate the legitimacy of the explanations that you offer derived from that principle. The real question is, what is a better candidate to be the ultimate explanatory principle? We're talking about life, we're talking about the origin of information. The only thing we have to go on in deciding that question is our ordinary experience, our uniform and repeated experience. And there I think that's where the appeal to mind provides a more adequate or a satisfactory explanation than matter, for the simple reason that we don't have experience of matter producing either information or, for that matter, consciousness itself.
There's one further point to add. If one argues the universe had to have an explanation, an origin, and one rejects the hypothesis of a deity on the grounds that it too requires an explanation, then by force of logic, either there is no answer to the question, or the universe itself must be its own explanation. That is, we accept the universe as a given, just as a theologian would accept the existence of God as a given. The trouble with that dialectical position is that if it's refined analytically, it becomes glaringly unacceptable, because in order for that to be persuasive, some of the characteristics traditionally applied to the deity would have to be applied to the universe itself. Yeah. Among them are necessity. And this was a hope of very many serious physicists in the 1970s and 1980s, Steven Weinberg, for example.
Meaning self-existence, essentially.
It's absolutely necessary. The laws of existence are unique, and that is why the universe exists, but it doesn't appear to be true. So there is a real balancing point where the theological argument, although it looks as if it is irrefutable in terms of the ultimate candidates for explanations, it may be preferable to the physical arguments.
That's a profound point, David, and because what you're referring to, for example, the fine-tuning initial conditions, that the universe in its initial state, which was critical to its developing the way to make life possible, for example, has properties that are contingent. They could have been otherwise. They're not necessary. They didn't have to be.
Why did the universe begin in this extraordinary entropic state? We don't have an explanation for that.
A lot of intelligent design literature has focused on weighing the claims of undirected evolution and finding them lacking. My question is, what sort of positive research questions does intelligent design provide for researchers to answer instead of merely negatively critiquing evolution? What sort of positive lines of research does intelligent design provide for scientists and engineers of various disciplines?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. In the epilogue to my book, I lay out the part of the research program of intelligent design. First thing I'd say, though, is that you can see in the case that I made tonight that the case for intelligent design is not just a critique of undirected chemical evolution. If we are weighing the causal adequacy, which is the term of art, of the competing hypotheses, you do have to critique those causes or proposed causes that are sufficient. But you don't affirm another cause as the best explanation unless it's known to have the power to produce the effect in question. So I looked at a number of causes that are known to be insufficient to produce functionally specified information or digital code. But I also affirmed the action of a cause of which we know, a type of cause of which we know, which is capable. So there's positive evidence of intelligent design, again, based on our uniform and repeated experience of what mind can do as opposed to purely material processes. But then going forward, the theory of intelligent design also then generates some discriminating predictions. For example, I talked about the junk DNA, the issue of junk DNA. In the 80s, when this first became apparent that sections of the genome were not coding for proteins, it was immediately assumed, especially by many Darwinists, that was a confirmation of their expectation, that there was a section of the genome that was the result of the trial and error process of natural selection acting on random mutations, and that all that so-called junk was the remnant of that process. In the mid-90s, a number of ID advocates, including Bill Dembski and Forrest Mims and Dean Kenyon, predicted that as we learn more about the genome, we'd begin to find that those non-coding regions of the genome would be functional. We acknowledge that mutational processes are real, but we thought if the genome had been designed by an intelligent agent, that you wouldn't expect the noise to be dwarfing the signal, that the overwhelming story about the genome is that it should be functional. That prediction has been verified and confirmed by a number of new studies, including the things that have been published out of something called the ENCODE project in 2007. So that's an example of a a research question that flows out of intelligent design and a prediction that goes with it. In my book, I sketch out a whole bunch of others. Partly, one of the reasons that you can generate interesting research questions is that we know something about how designing intelligence is, how design engineers process information, how the kinds of design patterns that engineers direct. And with that knowledge of how we ourselves do it, on the assumption that life is designed, we can expect that we might find some of those kinds of strategies at work in the cell and go look to find them. And so there's actually a number of research questions that flow from the assumption of design. I unpack them in the book.